Our next group of speakers is, the topic is Five's a Charm for the Great Lakes Yen. Our next panel of speakers will provide a more intimate details about the 5th year of the Great Lakes Yen program. Joanna Follings, who is on the leadership team of the Great Lakes Yen and serving a parallel position at the Ontario Ministry of Ag and Rural Affairs, is the same as Dennis Pennington is here in Michigan. They will provide information from this side of the pond, and Roger will join them to include the work from the United Kingdom. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to these three speakers.
While we were sitting here today, we decided to throw up some data based on some of the conversation that Roger brought to bring you some context to what they found in the UK and what we're actually seeing here within the Great Lakes region. I'm just going to show you the Michigan data and some of the regional data, so I took out all the other boring Ontario stuff. Oh, interesting. Okay, so we just threw this slide up to give you a bit of a reminder of what Roger talked about in terms of a wheat ideotype. So what is the ideal situation or the ideal scenario to get 15 tons per hectare wheat? So just a little bit of a reminder on that. So what we want to talk about is what it takes to get 150 plus bushels in the Great Lakes region is kind of the number that we're going to focus on. So we're seeing very similar trends to what Roger talked about. So obviously we want to promote no-till practices, and this is the ideal way that we want to continue to grow wheat in the region. But we do see a little bit of a yield lag when it comes to no-till versus some of the other tillage methods that we do see. A lot of the tillage, or a lot of the tillage data actually comes from the south, and particularly in Kentucky, where they grow most of their wheat after corn. So they have to use tillage to manage some of that residue. Whereas the majority of those 300 farms, oh, actually, no, this is just Michigan and Ontario. So in our larger data set, most of the tillage comes from Kentucky, but you can see here that over half of the farmers, or 3/4 of the farmers in Michigan and Ontario are using no-till practices. And the yield lag is really only a couple bushels. The other piece that Roger talked about was a trend looking at narrow row spacing, and we're seeing the exact same trend here. So the most of the folks in the entire region, so this is 624 farms of data, and 490 of them are using 7.5-inch row spacing. But when you jump to 5-6-inch row spacings, we don't have as many farms in those parts, but we're definitely seeing a yield increase. And our top growers year over year, most of them or many of them have been on 5-inch row spacings. I don't want to call them out, but Jeff Crone being one of them, who's here. And interesting there to see Broadcast Incorporated. I think Dennis and I were both a bit surprised by how well Broadcast Incorporated is actually doing. We have a grower in Ontario that does this year over year and has really great results. We're still a fan of seeding wheat directly, but it's interesting to see that the Broadcast Incorporated was in line with our 7.5-inch row spacing, but those growers are using much, much higher seeding rates. The other piece that Roger talked about was around planting date, and so this is a practice, or the thing that I probably promote the most in my part of the world. You know, it's very challenging in some cases to get wheat planted on time, but this is by far the most cost-effective or most efficient way of increasing your yield potential. If you're not planting on time, you will never get to the same yield potential as your optimum planting date. And Dennis and Manny, as well as Dave Hooker and Emma Dillman in Ontario, have done some really great work to show this and validate this. And planting date, in my opinion, trumps everything. And so here's the differences here. So we've got on your, I guess on your left, we've got the seeding date there of mid-September compared to all the way in November, where that seed is barely germinating by the beginning of December. And I don't know about you, but I think I would rather take that plant or over even the one that's planted on October 15th. And no seeding rate, no management is going to get you out of a late planting date. We do an analysis where we compare the top 20% of all producers across all years versus the bottom 20% of producers across all years. We just pulled out the Michigan data for this. But the blue bars are our top 20% of producers in Michigan, and the green bars are the bottom 20% of producers in Michigan. And you can see there, we've got quite the spread in planting date. With the exception of 2025, we have almost a 2-week advantage in the high-yielding producers compared to the low-yielding producers. So those high-yielding producers are always seeding in September, probably that second, third week of September. In 2025, interestingly enough, there's only a 1-day difference in planting day averages. But if you recall, we had a very beautiful, nice open fall this past year. And so a lot of growers got their wheat planted because they got their beans off early. Unfortunately, in most cases because it was how dry it was. But they got their beans off early, and there was only a 1-day planting day difference between the top and bottom this past year. And so Roger talked a lot about biomass as well. I'm sorry, I'm zipping through this, but we have a lot of things to discuss. So Roger talked a lot about biomass, and we see very similar trends in this part of the world. This is just Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario data, but very similar. You can see once we hit past mid to late September, we're no longer able to achieve our target biomass, or what we're seeing with our high-yielding producers is 17,000 plus pounds of biomass per acre. And once we hit past mid-September, it's really hard to achieve those biomass numbers. And you can see once we get into October, we're well below 15,000 pounds of biomass. Another very common question that Dennis and I get is, what are the nitrogen rates that folks are using? We often get challenged that high-yielding producers are throwing everything but the kitchen sink at their crop. They're putting piles and piles of money in and not getting that back. But that actually couldn't be the more opposite. And so, again, here, this is our average rate of nitrogen applied over the whole year. So that includes your fall nitrogen compared to just your spring nitrogen. So in Michigan, interestingly enough, growers are applying anywhere from 95 to almost 130 pounds of nitrogen. But as a whole, including your fall nitrogen, you're about 130 to 145 pounds of nitrogen. And I would say that this is slightly lower than what we're seeing across the entire yen and slightly lower than Ontario. Ontario, we're probably about 140 to 150 pounds of spring nitrogen, so slightly higher. This is all regions. Again, another common question. What are growers doing in terms of their nitrogen timing? Is it single application? Is it split application? Is it more? So the majority of producers in the yen, so this is 612 farms, are doing a 2-way split. And this is just spring applications. So 69% of producers did a 2-way split in 2025. But when we look across all years, it's slightly lower at about 62%, whereas single applications were only about 25% across all years. We've got 10% that are doing 3 applications, and then we've got a very small percentage that are going across 4 or 5 times in a season. And I would say when you actually dive into this data, the 3-way splits are often hard red wheat growers. I'm sure it's the same here in Michigan, but Ontario, we get a protein premium for our hard red. So those growers that are doing a 3-way split, that third split is typically with a product called Amidas. It's a nitrogen sulfur product, and they're applying that at the boot stage approximately, and most of that nitrogen is going strictly for protein. So that's where a lot of those 3 ways come from. And then we overlay that with yield. Again, you can see that our 2-way splits, sorry, this one's got a bit of backward color, but our 2-way splits in this one are the blue bars, and across all years had an average yield of 117 compared to 111 in our single split. So across all of these farms, we're definitely seeing a value add to that split nitrogen. And what we're hearing from growers is that they're able to tailor their end management to the year that they're having. So they can put a bit of nitrogen up on front, manage that based on the level of tillering they have and planting date that they're dealing with, and then they can come back and top up with however little or however much they need depending on what the season's bringing. I think Marty presented on this earlier, and maybe you presented this a little bit too, just around fungicide response. So another very common question, and again, this is across all years. Most of the farms, out of the 624 farms, a third of them are doing a T1, T3 application. and on average they're getting about 120 bushels compared to a no fungicide application, which was only 66 farms and had an average yield of 102 bushels. And then the next most common application timing, of course, is for fusarium, or as you call it here, head scab, 161 farms, which had an average yield of 114. This T3, T4 is a bit of an outlier. The grower was a bit concerned with the timing of their initial T3 application, so they came back. So that data point is definitely an outlier. In terms of environmental conditions, this is again across all regions and all years, and you can see here that even though the high yielding producers had slightly less, they had about an average of an inch less of available water, they were actually better able to utilize and access the water that's available to them. So their estimated use in general as a whole was much higher than our lower yielding producers. What was interesting when we put all of the data together, all the soil types, we didn't have that much difference in soil available water. However, we don't measure rooting depth. We make some assumptions on rooting depth. So we think on some farms, and Jeff, I'm sorry to pick on you, but on Jeff's farm, for example, we think there might be like a perched water table. And so things like that are very hard to account for when we're calculating the soil available water. But these are some of our best estimates. Oops. In terms of our average yields, and then we talk about crop modeling, what we think you could actually achieve on farm. So it's interesting across all years, our yields are about 115, 116 bushels per acre. We had a slight bump in 2023, which was a really good wheat year. And if we take out 2021, because we didn't update that yield potential modeling, but you can see in 22, 23, we were 156 to 165 was our average potential across all farms. But we actually jumped up in 24 and 25 to 200 or over 200 bushels per acre. And we went from achieving 70 to 80% of our potential. Now we're down to 57 to 61% of our potential. So not quite sure what happened in 24 compared to 22 and 23, but something we'll have to dive into more. And then when we look at Michigan yields, so again, I talked about those high versus low. So our high yielding producers in Michigan, with the exception of 2021, we're at 140 to 150 bushels per acre, which is excellent. But we could definitely help some of our lower yielding producers and identify where are some of the gaps in their management, what are some of the things that we might be missing the mark on, because you can see there our highest yield amongst the lowest growers was just at 92 bushels per acre. So those are the growers we want to help understand again what the gaps are and help bring them up to the same level as those high yielding producers. And then in terms of some of the yield components or the things that we can influence or that we believe we can influence, and Roger talked about this, is definitely our head counts, our heads per meter square. So this, again, just Michigan data. We had 80 to 90 bushels versus 140 to 150, and our heads counts are missing the mark again. So we're 480 to 600, where our high-yielding producers tend to always be above 800 heads per meter square, and that 800 heads per meter square definitely pays true across all our regions and all of our growers. We see if they're above 800, they're hitting 150 bushels plus. And then again, just similar trends to what Roger spoke about. Again, kind of obvious, the more kernels per meter square we get, the higher yields we get. And similar, again, with biomass, you can see our high-yielding producers in Michigan are about 16 to 17,000 pounds of biomass, which our lower-yielding producers are barely at 10,000 pounds of biomass. So again, some work there to try to get those crop canopies growing and bigger and utilizing the resources available to them. And then Dennis pulled this interesting analysis together this year because we wanted to look at, the number of days over 30 degrees Celsius. We could probably even look at less and go, days over 25 degrees Celsius because we definitely see an impact there. But interesting, Washington and Pennsylvania had some of the highest days over 30 this year with over 10 days. Michigan, though, wasn't far behind at 8.6 days. So if you've got a 34-day grain fill period and almost 9 of those days are over 30 degrees, you're really shaving that yield off the top. on top of moisture limitations, which again, it's very difficult for us to do. We look at rainfall over the whole season, but we literally need to dive deeper into the timing of some of that rainfall, especially during the grain fill period. And then again, just to wrap it up here, here's a quick look at what some of the impacts of those hot days are on some of the pieces. So, we tend to see an impact on grains per meter square in particular. So the third last column here, we see those go down as we get more heat in the grain fill period, which isn't really a huge surprise there. Biomass also seems to have a downward trend as we get higher hot days, and the heads per meter square kind of seems to be a bit all over the place, but definitely seeing an impact there on grains per meter square as well as our overall biomass. So just wanted to kind of, and then this is the last one, sorry. So the other thing we wanted to look at was our yield impact or our yield differences between the top and the low yielding producers based on different growth stage. So in the top left there, you can see that the blue dots, we tend to have an emergent state earlier than the lower yielding producers, but for every other aspect of growth and development, the high yielding producers are always later than the lower yielding producers, meaning that there's more time between each of the growth stages, similar to what Roger's talking about in the UK. And so as a result, we're able to take advantage of those wider windows of growth and development between each of the growth stages, which is ultimately impacting our final yield. So I know that was kind of a lot, but.
Okay, so Roger and Joanna have set the stage, and what we want to do is have a discussion with you. And we want to talk about, let's get into the weeds about wheat growth and development and how do we manage that crop. I see when we had some of our numbers up here, I see you shaking your head, Roger, like how are you supporting that? Do you have any comments you want to start with?
Well, the first thing I need to say is I'm not coming here to teach you how to farm in your environment. I do not understand your environment. The most surprising thing, the biggest contrast with what I see with our crops is you have 800 or 900 heads. That's enormous. We would never conceive of having that number of heads. So, and there are all sorts of, there are all questions. I don't understand why you have that number of heads. And I don't understand why that doesn't generate a lot of very weak stems, so you have a lot of lodging. I can see there's a lot of, I don't know why there isn't a lot of competition, which means that the bottom of your canopy is very often so shaded that it's not doing anything useful. I think it probably is something to do with the fact that the growth stages, the phases of growth are so short. So everything, and particularly the number of spikelets and the number of grains per spikelet, so the number of grains per head, is only 60% of what we have. I mean, that's the big difference is you have 60% of our grain numbers per head, but you have 50% more heads.
We need the heads to make up for the number of kernels per spikelet.
Yeah, which seems, from a UK point of view, it seems an inefficient structure, but I don't understand how you could possibly change to make it more efficient.
I'll comment on that. I've seen pictures of your wheat. Your wheat looks like pine cones. My wheat will never be confused for pine cones. So, I mean.
I would agree with that. The heads in the UK are huge, and your 1,000 kernel weight and your kernels per head are much higher, and I think that's definitely genetics is a part of it and your environment, because we'll take your genetics and try them here, and we were talking about this last night. Some of them won't even elongate, just because, I think we were talking day length is also likely a part of that as well.
Question back here.
This picture of his heads of his wheat, and I've heard from you guys that have been to Europe before, they have this tabletop heads, okay, that's all uniform. It's like a cornfield, and our wheat fields look like a mess. They're up and down and all these small ones. To what extent do you think, does that really matter for us, or?
Roger, I'd like to get your input on that. So you use some plant growth regulators. How do you manage the size of heads? And like when you pull out a plant and you look at all the heads on one plant, are they uniform in size? Are they, you got small ones?
Was your question about stem length as well, so height? Because it does look a bit like a tabletop when you look at Tim Lammerman's field, and whereas, well, I would expect it to look less and less like a tabletop depending on how many seeds you sow. So it'll be more like a tabletop if most of the stems are main stems and not tillers. Yeah, and the tillers will be slightly shorter. But there is, I mean, I don't think that
You seed last, most of your heads are like tiller heads. Okay, they're not main stem.
yeah, I mean, we only have, I mean, we only have about 2.5, is that right? Tillers. No, we have 1.5 tillers, so we have one main stem and 2.5 tillers, 2 or 3 tillers. So, I mean, it's not, we don't have, the 4th or 5th tiller that come out die before they get to fruition.
Other questions? Over here.
Here, Dennis.
No irrigation. Well, we had one grower that did, and he did increase the yield a lot, but yeah. But I mean, it's a very relevant question to me. I think longer term, we have to think of the possibility of irrigation. I mean, it'll all depend on the price of grain and so on. But longer term, I mean, we will be more and more short of water.
Other questions? You got one.
You just said that you over in the UK are pushing for one main stem and 2.5 tillers at the most on each seed that's planted. 1.5, okay. And over here, we've been with the mentality or have been pushed where we want one seed to produce 4 or 5 tillers. So are you telling us or indicating to us that our seed varieties should be producing one main tiller to get this great big 6-inch long head compared to 4 or 5 tillers producing a 3-inch head? That's what it sounds like. Okay, that's what it sounds like. We're doing it backwards.
Yeah, I agree, but it might be for a very good reason, because you really have not enough time to form all.
And genetics.
We don't have a long enough growing period. Is that what we're?
Yeah, you don't have a long enough growing period, but anything you can do to make it longer would be better. Would make
We better all get on our knees and start praying to the good Lord Almighty.
Well, why do your crops die?
Why do they die?
Yeah,
They matured.
yeah, but why do they mature? I mean, they don't. Ours don't mature that quick. So, I mean, I think there's some genetics. I don't know where's.
So let me add to the discussion here a little bit. So it's a good question to ask. You're saying that you're trying to get less tillers, so less heads, and the data showed that. We're getting what, maybe close to 3 times. Well, about double the number of heads is what you are.
Well, we're 600 for our high yields, and you're 900 for your high yields.
Okay. So we're producing more heads. There's less spikelets on our heads and less seeds within each head.
Yeah.
So the question would be then, can we go to your philosophy of planting less seed, and can we grow that bigger head and have more spikelets and more seeds per head? And that's the real question. And then can we fill those?
Can you, this is a very public forum for me to have received my education, but I want to know when when is first node stage? Growth stage 31, whatever that is in Feeks.
When is that?
When does it happen?
That happens in early April.
Early
Mid-April.
April. Because spikelet,
mid to late April.
I mean, spikelet number has been determined, or is just determined at that point. So the health and vitality of your plant before that point is very important for your spikelets to develop.
What would happen if the gentleman that grew the high yield wheat over there
Yeah.
took that variety and give it to our high yield wheat here? The genetics, would they act similar?
I don't think ours are particularly frost sensitive, so
I'll get to you.
it's a very good idea.
I think Eric has an opinion on this.
But yeah, we do. We need the plant breeder.
I want to make a comment on that. We did test in 2019. We did test a variety from the UK. It's called Motown. We tested it. It was entered twice in the state yield trial under 2 different seeding rates. You could change the name to No Town, basically, for production in Michigan, because it was too late in maturity, like it flowered. Far too late. It was photoperiod sensitive. The majority of our varieties are photoperiod sensitive. So this UK variety, it's designed for that longer grain fill period. So it maybe only had 1 photoperiod sensitivity gene, or was fairly insensitive. It flowered too late in the season, and so when it got hotter in June, it just didn't have time to fill grain relative to the other varieties.
When you say too late, what do you mean?
Means it flowered about a week and a half later, so that means it was shorted by about a week and a half for grain fill.
But is there a date by which you have to harvest because you've got to plant the next crop, or what are the logistics like?
Right. So it was later than, like, we had to. There were cases where the grain moisture was quite high, right? When other varieties would have been like at 13 to 14%, this would have been at 19, 20. So it just wasn't. It wasn't adapted. It was just a matter of simply a matter of adaptation and rationale for needing plant breeding programs all over. Different varieties for the Southeast, for the plains in the U.S. Every environment needs genetics tailored to that environment.
I mean, the plant breeders I talk to say that wheat doesn't travel.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely true.
And I saw that growing in the field, and that wheat did not look like UK wheat at all. The UK wheat is like this high, and it is solid. Those stalks are really thick. The leaves are very wide and very long. It didn't even look like UK wheat grown in our conditions.
Yeah.
If you're letting these varieties mature much later, and like I think maybe that's what Eric was getting to as well, is that we're gonna have way more days over 30 degrees if we push that maturity or that anthesis later. Like, because once we get into July, it gets really hot.
Yeah.
Like much more than, we don't get the nice cool weather that you continue to have through the summer. I thought I would throw this up here because Roger talked about spikelet count being set at stem elongation. And I think this is another place when we talk about the attention to detail. I didn't show the slides, but like our high yielding producers on average are spending about a bushel or more less, or a dollar per bushel or more, $1 per bushel less than our low yielding producers. And in some cases it's much higher. But one of the things that those high yielding producers are doing a good job of is getting the nitrogen out and the sulfur out when the crop actually needs it. So Roger talked about how at stem elongation spikelet count is determined. And so this is from Ontario. This is some work where a lot of tissue and grain analysis was done over a season on all nutrients to kind of determine what's our actual uptake in wheat, just like we have here for corn. And so at this stem elongation phase, we see this time and time again where growers haven't even put a single drop of nitrogen or sulfur out there. And so that crop is already short of nutrients, which is going to impact your spikelet count. But what's really important to note is that half of your nitrogen is taken up at the plant by second node. This is Ontario data, but I suspect it's the exact same as here in Michigan. And 70% of our nitrogen is taken up by flagleaf. So if you're not putting on any nitrogen until past second node and almost at flagleaf, you're missing the mark. And then 85% of our nitrogen is taken up by anthesis. So I had mentioned those hard red growers because they'll put it on between flag and anthesis, and most of that nitrogen, and you can see that's the blue there, that nitrogen is going all into the grain for protein. So these are key growth stages or uptake timings to make note of, to make sure that you have enough nitrogen in at least half of the plant's requirement out there by second node.
Okay. Other questions? Brandon?
Based on what she's just saying, what's the time difference in days or weeks between second node and flag leaf?
Time difference between second node and flag leaf.
It depends on the year.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely depends on the year. In some cases, for us, it could be 2 weeks, and in other cases, it could be less than that. If it's a really hot year, sometimes we even see from flag leaf to anthesis, if it's really, really hot, can be condensed immensely, which they don't get that in the UK.
That's a 2-week window, and I have to make sure I'm going to get a little rain in between there to
Yeah.
wash that in, otherwise
This,
it's sitting on the surface. So
it's all a lot easier said than done.
timing is really, really important and earlier.
Yes, I would agree with that. We didn't go into this as much, but a lot of the high-yielding producers, they're putting in their first application like ammonium sulfate. They're putting on ammonium sulfate right at green up, getting the sulfur needs out there. When the soil is cool, mineralization's low, the crop needs sulfur during that time with a bit of nitrogen, and then they're coming back. Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened, what I did there. They're coming back in between or somewhere around that second node for the remainder, or just before that for the remainder. But that often coincides with soybean planting, corn planting, herbicide burn downs. So it is, I recognize it's very difficult. And so, like I said, it's way easier for me to be standing up here and tell you what to do, but in application, it's quite difficult.
So you brought up a good point, and we're headed into the season where we're going to start making nitrogen applications. So what's your philosophy on how do you determine when in the spring to start putting nitrogen on? Is there a particular target growth stage? How do you determine if you're going to split it? How much do you put on early? How much late? And how do you make those decisions from a management perspective?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that we're not allowed to put on any on and before the middle of February. So I've been watching all the talk on our press, and it's all about starting applying now. And the philosophy has generally been, Dennis has asked me this question before, so I'm rehearsed in this. The philosophy has generally been to apply the largest application at growth stage 31, and to apply a small amount before that to encourage the survival of the tillers that have come through the winter. So, and then maybe apply a third application, either by splitting the main application, so it would be sort of 31 and 32, or to go back in later at growth stage 37 with a smaller application to keep the canopy alive through grain filling. I'm still not sure we've got it right, and we've seen our climate has been decreasing the rainfall in the spring, particularly in April. So what you're saying over there, I can't remember who it was, said basically, how do I rely on it raining and getting my nitrogen in? I think you have to budget on getting the nitrogen in before that, and give yourself a better chance of a good dose of rain to get it in. But you have to recognize that the inefficiencies of nitrogen, nitrogen is generally only taken up 60% by the crop. The rest is gobbled up by the soil bugs. And the longer you leave that to happen, possibly the more inefficient it'll be. So you're sort of balancing two inefficiencies. Whether it, again, this is UK experience, so.
Other questions? Yep.
Okay, this is for Roger. So we determined that our good growers here, our top growers, are getting about 800 heads per meter. And in Europe, they're growing about 600 heads per meter. So here, I'm looking at my yen, we're producing about 25,000 grains per meter. How many grains per meter are you producing over there? Because I'm trying to figure out
32.
32,000. So you have way less heads, but bigger heads, plus they're also producing more grains per head.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the question I have.
And I am sort of worried about, well, Joanna just had the nitrogen up before this, and these graphs, I'd like to know from Peter Johnson what they look like and how they died. Because, I mean, my lesson from the UK is we need to study the crop death. It's not really death, it's the senescence of the canopy is very important, and how that happens and the pattern at which that happens. And that happens, I think, because the nutrients are being taken out of the canopy and put into the grain, because the crop is more, despite everything that the plant breeders have done, there's been a lot more evolution in favor of regeneration of the crop than there has been in the productivity of the crop. So the regeneration of the crop requires that that a viable seed is formed, and that needs particularly phosphorus, but also nitrogen and sulfur and zinc. So I want to know whether that movement of nitrogen out of the canopy and the movement of phosphorus out of the canopy was causing that canopy to die. That's my question I have about that.
There's definitely been some differences in the last couple of years in the fungicide products used at T3. Do you have Miravis Ace here? Yeah, so Miravis Ace, like all of our livestock producers will not use it anymore because of the stay green effect it has. So it actually keeps the canopy green and going longer than some of the other products available. But as a livestock producer who's trying to dry down that straw to utilize, they found it to be a real pain because it never really dries down the same. But there are growers that will pick that product. If they're not livestock producers, they'll actually seek out Miravis Ace because of the stay green effect it has. And their theory is that they're prolonging their grain fill period.
So Roger, you brought up something that I guess I'd like to talk a little bit more about, and can you put the phosphorus chart up there? One of the things that we notice on our wheat here that I did not notice walking your fields is you have the top 4 leaves are green, solid all the way through the growing season, right down into that lower canopy. Yeah. What we tend to see here is as we move through that grain fill period, we see those lower leaves start to fire up. They turn yellow, and then they fire up, and then they start drying down. And by the end of the grain fill period, we don't have 4 leaves anymore. We might have 2, maybe 2.5 leaves that are still green and actively photosyntheting. Do you have ideas about maybe what you think might be contributing to that? Is it related to phosphorus? Is there management things we can do to keep that canopy green all the way to the bottom longer? Like what you were doing there.
I don't have a straightforward recipe like that.
You don't have the magic answer?
I mean, ultimately, we've got nutrition in our hands, sort of, but we don't, because we don't irrigate, and I think none of you irrigate, or maybe we did have a winner who irrigated, but because we don't have the water in our hands, and it's the water that's dictating the potential of the crop. So we need to be anticipating that potential with our nutrition. That's how, and I mean, you need moisture, obviously, to satisfy transpiration so that photosynthesis can continue during that grain filling period. But you also need a bit of moisture to get the nitrogen or the phosphorus or whatever it is still coming in. And I'm very, it's a sort of new, from our yen, to me it's a discovery that the nutritional status of that canopy before it started filling the grain is very influential on, so I guess, I mean, it's only a supposition, I haven't got any experimental evidence for this, but if we could find ways of building the nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus content of the canopy at flowering, it would do us some good, particularly if the moisture was there to keep it going.
Okay. Does everybody understand that and follow that thought pattern? Do you have questions about that?
I'll bring up the one instance, the yen farmer who is growing barley in Scotland, so moisture is more plentiful in Scotland. I know that because I live on the west coast and we have 2 meters of rain a year. But he heard us talking this sort of, having this sort of discussion, and he decided to try diammonium phosphate as a spray, just a small amount during grain filling, and he says he increased his yield by a ton per hectare. So, yeah, it is possible that we should be doing some experiments in this area.
So it seems what you're saying is we need to, earlier in the season, we need to build that crop canopy a little bit stronger, a little bit earlier, and make sure it's protected from disease, make sure it has adequate nutrition, and hopefully adequate water, which we can't control because we're not primarily under irrigation. But we've got to build that canopy early in order to have enough nutrient uptake to support this translocation, because you look at the blue there, almost all of that phosphorus translocates right out of the plant and goes right into the grain.
I mean, I know Peter's not here, and I don't know whether Joanna can answer, but I mean, I'm astonished that this is showing that 50% of the phosphorus uptake happens during grain filling after anthesis, which is astonishing.
We were just chatting because in the UK they can't put any nitrogen on until January 15th, is it, or something? You can't put any nitrogen on until January 15th, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they can't put any nitrogen with their phosphorus in the fall. And I wonder if you have poor phosphorus uptake because nitrogen helps with phosphorus uptake. And so if you have no nitrogen down with that phosphorus in the fall, I wonder if that's why your phosphorus uptake is poor. But I'm also surprised by this. I would have thought it would have been opposite.
I don't know.
So I don't know why this is the way that it is, though. We have some other, I can show sulfur is very similar to wheat. Again, 70+% is in the plant by flag leaf, and then 90% by anthesis. And here's potassium.
Potassium, this is the only nutrient that is actually lost before harvest, as far as I can understand it. And we did some work to see how the potassium is lost, and there was a lot of talk about the rain actually leaching it out of the leaves, but apparently it's redistributed to the roots and happens irrespective of whether it rains or not.
And we'll see, we've done some sampling with straw that's been harvested, and for every rain it gets, we see a decline in potassium in the straw for every rain too. Yeah. What other nutrients we got here? Anyone? Magnesium? Manganese, this is one I don't know about here in Michigan, but is anyone seeing this? We're seeing this deficiency more and more, manganese deficiency, weirdly enough. You too? Yeah, I'm not totally sure why that is, but we're definitely seeing more of it. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, some of the graphs I decided not to show you show us with a picture of declining levels of several nutrients in the grain over the time we've been measuring. So we've only been measuring, well, it's now 10 years. But phosphorus has been declining, sulfur has been declining, manganese has stayed the same. There's various other nutrients that I don't really understand the significance of, but iron is definitely declining, calcium is declining, and there's very little calcium in the grain. So, I mean, I think we're leading the world in grain analysis of all nutrients, and we really need to share our data and try and understand the significance of it. I've given talks to lots of organizations about the value of, and we have an international, they call it international, but it really means European fertilizer society in Europe, and I told them the value of this, and we're sort of trying to get it spread, but farmers in Europe certainly are fairly conservative about changing their crop monitoring approach. So they measure their soil levels, but they don't measure their grain levels, except in the UK, where we have been more successful. But I think it's a very useful barometer of how good your nutrition is if you can measure at harvest what the crop's got in it.
Another one that I think would be of interest to this group is boron. So boron often comes back deficient on tissue and grain analysis. But what was interesting, I don't know if you can see that there, the max uptake is 65 grams per hectare. Like, it is a very, very small amount that the wheat actually takes up. And I'm astonished by how many growers are applying boron. And so if there's anywhere I could save you money, it's on your boron. If you apply boron once, you should be good for 70 years based on this research. So sorry for the salespeople, but I do think this is an area where you could probably save some dollars. I know in corn there's been some work on boron, but based on the work that we've seen with boron, we rarely see a response, and I see tons of growers applying it, and I just think that this is somewhere you could save. If you need to save some input costs in 2026, it would be on this.
I've got some opposite evidence.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Oh, all right. Let's hear it, Roger.
We didn't rehearse this, so this is bound to happen. But in our yen data, there is a negative relationship. No, there's a big decline in grain boron during our 10 years, and there is a positive association between yield and boron application. I mean, we've only recorded, did you apply boron or didn't you apply boron? And the ones that said yes rather than no tend to have high yields. Whether that's just a chance association or whether that's something functional, I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know the starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is on plot work, not in field. We got zinc. I don't know.
Can we change gears to change focus a little bit? Let's talk about, you're growing, you got these giant heads,
Yeah.
okay, with a lot of seeds in them. I imagine they're pretty heavy.
Yeah.
How do you keep them things from laying flat on the ground when you get wind? You get wind, I assume.
We definitely get wind, and the crops don't at all stand up. I would say the plant breeders have got a lot better at breeding for standing power, as we call it. So we haven't seen as much lodging. I mean, I can tell you, 1992 was a seriously bad lodging year. 1977, and 1987 and I can tell you the lodging years because we've done a whole lot of work on, and my boss, who used to be my student, is Pete Berry, has spent his life working on, his PhD and a lot of work since studying lodging, and we understand a lot more about lodging, and we can, I don't know whether you understand lodging as either a failure of the stem or a failure of the root. And with us, it's more commonly a failure of the root. So it falls over and cuts a slot in the soil as it falls over. But And so we've been, focusing on the structure of the top anchorage roots, as we call them, and whether the roots go like that or like that makes a difference. But I guess the answer, Dennis, is that they've been bred to have those big fat stems and to have decent anchorage roots, and we see a definite benefit of having low seed rates, because then you have better anchorage roots. If you're showing a lot of seeds.
What depth?
About 2 inches. Yeah.
How are growers using the PGRs to sync their tillers up with their main stems?
Sorry.
How are they using PGRs to sync up their tillers with their main stems?
They don't think of PGRs as altering the. They don't think of PGRs as altering the size of the head. It's just total stem length and its insurance. It's not a yield enhancing treatment, and as we understand it, and we wouldn't talk about it like that. But I have to say, against Tim Lammerman, I have visited his farm quite a number of times, and quite a number of his crops were flat when I have visited. He does see lodging.
All right. Other questions out here? Anybody? Any other topics that we haven't covered? Do you want to talk about? Would you like to get some of the yields that he's getting? Yeah, I sure would too. So we're trying to do research, and we're trying to understand, after visiting there and learning about some of these differences between how you grow your wheat and some of the yield components that you have. Can we do that here? And when I walk through our breeding plots, and I don't know if Eric's still here or not. Yeah. So when we walk the breeding plots in those space planted plots where the seeds are planted 12 inches apart, we can get them great big giant heads. But the question is, when we try to put them through a planting system in a commercial production, things go a little bit haywire. And when you're spacing them a foot apart, that one plant has enough space and resources that it can take up all the light it needs, and there's less competition for nutrients and for water. And so that one plant can do that, and we can produce plants similar to what you have, but when we try to put it into a commercial field scale, that's where things go a little bit wonky, and that's why our yield components are a little bit different, and why we have...
But then I'm understanding the determination of your lower grain number as being something that's constrained by time. And so if one plant can do it on its own, why can't 100 plants do it?
Well, so we have some growers that are hitting above 30,000 seeds per meter squared. Okay,
Yeah.
those are hitting the 170, 180 yields that we're getting. So we can hit those high number of seeds, but you're doing it with less heads, but bigger heads. We're doing it with more heads, but smaller heads.
Yeah.
The other key difference between here and there is the seeds that you have weigh probably 30 or 40% heavier. Okay, you look at your 1,000 kernel weight. Each individual seed is filled out better, and that's where the time comes in. You have a longer grain fill period. You have more time to fill that out. So we're faced with the climate that we have, and so we're trying to figure out how do we make the best of what we have. And so that's why we're doing research. And Eric's involved, Manny's involved, the Michigan Wheat Program's funding a bunch of it. So we're trying to figure out, can we meet more of your crop model and try to improve those yields, but we haven't got it all figured out yet. So, does anybody have any further questions? All right. Yeah, over here. A question is, what form of nitrogen do you use in the UK?
We use ammonium nitrate primarily, which I know you don't use at all. But a minority use urea. We're generally solid rather than liquid, but we do have a proportion of growers, probably 20-25%, that use liquid.
And that's dry? Ammonium nitrate's dry product?
Yeah, yeah. And, well, it's...
Some you were using liquid urea. Were some using liquid urea or no?
Liquid urea would not be used unless it was used to boost protein at the end of the season, yeah.
All right, is there any final questions before we wrap up here? All right, well, I have the pleasure of working with Roger and Joanna on the yen and all this data, and we share ideas and things like that. So I feel very fortunate to be in the position where I am, and I'm happy that both of you were able to be here today to share some of your wisdom with the group here. So let's give these guys a round.
The amount of work in those slides that Joanna deserves a special clap of her own.